Hi, everybody. My name is Hunter Tuinstra, and I'll be presenting my paper, Apophenia and Alien Love, Extraterrestrial Encounters as Technologies of the Self. Since the mid-1900s, Americans have been consistently fascinated by unidentified flying objects, and in the years since, a genealogy of experiences with them has been created by interested researchers, both inside and outside of the academy. As one might expect, a myriad of theories have come in and out of fashion to explain them. Instead of attempting to account for the whole of this body of work, this paper will pick up a specific thread of the aforementioned corpus. Specifically, I'm interested here in exploring how the narratives related by American UFO experiencers function as technologies of the self, as theorized by Michel Foucault. In the subsequent sections, after some theoretical and historical background, I discuss three narrative accounts of UFO experiences, as collected by John Mack and Yvonne Smith in their respective books, in order to show how these narratives serve to organize the lives and beliefs of those who create them in an increasingly fractured and fraught contemporary American cultural landscape. In addition, I offer some tentative reading of the recent UFO disclosure by the US government. John Mack discusses some of the more conventional conceptualizations of UFO encounters, breaking them into three levels. The first level is what Mack refers to as the nuts and bolts, those things that appear concretely within our immediate physical universe, such as, quote, visual sightings or radar spottings of UFOs, light and sound phenomena associated with them, the burned patches of Earth that they sometimes leave, end quote, etc. Mack asserts that this level of belief, inasmuch as it can be measured, studied, analyzed, and often perceived to be real, is what is most agreeable to Western science. The second category that Mack identifies is less easy to parse, things that, quote, look like they could be understood within our space-time universe, end quote, but that cannot currently be explained by Western science. This includes such things as spacecraft, alien-human hybrids, alien technology, and how each of these interacts with and moves through our reality. Finally, Mack discusses the third type, which he describes as, quote, the phenomena and experiences reported by abductees for which we can conceive of no explanation within a Newtonian, Cartesian, or even Einsteinian space-time ontology, end quote. These experiences are what one might expect, but Mack crucially notes that these are also those experiences most likely to be shouted down by debunkers and skeptics as hoax because of the lack of or impossibility of evidence, or dismissed as bouts of psychosis. These instances include things like, quote, the apparent mastery of thought travel by the aliens and sometimes by the abductees themselves. Abductees sense that their experiences are not occurring in our space-time universe or that space and time have collapsed. A consciousness, abductees experience of vast other realities beyond the screen of this one, beyond the veil. The deeply felt sense of opening up to or returning to the source of being and creation or cosmic consciousness, experienced by abductees as an inexpressibly divine light or home, the experience by abductees of dual human-alien identity, i.e. that they are themselves of alien origins, and the powerful reliving of past life experiences, including great cycles of life, birth, and death, end quote. It's worth citing this entire passage as it is these experiences, those that are outside of our apparent reality and system of natural laws, that are most often cited by experiencers as being the type that this piece is interested in. Those that fundamentally alter their subjectivity and that often function as the impetus for their narrativization and thus for their use as technologies of the self. As a counterpoint to Mack's more conventional ideas about the nature of extraterrestrial encounters and abductions, there are some, like astronomer and computer scientist Jacques Vallée, who believe that the phenomena is holistically much more than what it appears. It is Vallée's position that alien encounters and the abduction phenomena are inherently absurd, but that through the absurdity and illogic, they contain some essential kernel of truth or knowledge for humans to experience, that they have, quote, a symbolic meaning beyond apparent contradiction, end quote. Vallée calls this metalogic, that he sees being present in the stories of fairies, little people, and the like throughout history and folklore, and which he feels are part of something, though he's never explicit about what, whether that is a collective unconsciousness or physical, psychical phenomena that is meaningful to humanity. It is also because of this illogical quality that Vallée believes UFOs are not a nuts and bolts phenomena as, quote, there are many more landings and close encounters than would be required for a survey of our planet. The reported interaction with the occupants of the objects is absurd, and their overtly scientific experiments are crude to the point of being grotesque, end quote. And that beings with the intelligence to create and pilot what we call UFOs would not need to do any of the above in order to obtain the knowledge they are ostensibly after. Regardless of the differences in Vallée's perception of the abduction phenomena, he nevertheless shares some of Mack's ideas about the way that encounters themselves function. While Mack discusses the phenomena primarily in terms of his own cases as a practicing psychologist, Vallée has organized his ideas in a more general way, reducing the qualities of the experiences into 5 categories. 1. That the, quote, things we call unidentified flying objects are neither objects nor flying. They can dematerialize and they violate the laws of motion as we know them, end quote. 2. That UFOs and alien encounters are present throughout history and in every culture, simply manifesting differently in each time and place, hence the folklore connection. 3. That UFOs and their occupants, quote, are not necessarily caused by visits from space travelers, end quote, but are more likely to be something altogether stranger, outside our ideas of space and time. 4. That the lives of witnesses and experiencers are, quote, deeply changed, and they develop unusual talents with which they may find it difficult to cope, end quote. And 5, that human encounters with extraterrestrials are always controlled and initiated by the latter, and that, quote, the experiencer's characteristic feature is a factor of absurdity that leads to a rejection of the story by the upper layers of the target society and an absorption at a deep unconscious level of the symbols conveyed by the encounter, end quote. With the ideas of both Mack and Vallée in mind, we can begin to formulate a conception of the typical extraterrestrial encounter, what it looks like, and what it might mean. However, one aspect of the contemporary abduction phenomena is yet to be discussed, and that is the narrativization of the event by the experiencer. It is this narrativization that's crucial to the meaning-making and self-making that this piece is interested in. The following sections discuss both how narratives of an abduction experience come to be, as well as how they might be put in conversation with Foucault's conception of the technologies of the self. In Susan Clancy's Abducted, How People Come to Believe They Were Kidnapped by Aliens, the way that abduction narratives come out of culture and even out of necessity is discussed. Clancy, like Mack, comes from a background in the academy. She explains that the abduction phenomena, of course, might be sleep paralysis, might be repressed trauma, or any other conventional explanation that one might offer, but crucially, something is happening, and those who claim to have had experiences have been deeply affected by them. According to Clancy, the, quote, search for meaning is the catalyst for alien abduction belief, end quote, and especially the choice to narrativize them, usually by undergoing regression hypnosis or, at the very least, traditional talk therapy. UFO experiencers want to understand what's happened to them and why, and quote, some people believe that if they understand why they feel the way that they do, they'll be able to change some things for the better, end quote. Clancy argues that, regardless of one's reasoning, that abduction narratives take the shape they do because of the shared schema of information that exists on the phenomena in Western and particularly American culture. More generally, Clancy claims, quote, that experiencers' symptoms, feelings, and experiences are consistent with what they already know about alien abduction, end quote. And furthermore, the, quote, common features of the alien abduction stories, the elements of the basic plot, are not evidence of validity. They are evidence that these stories have been contrived out of shared cultural knowledge and shared psychological fears, needs, hopes, and limitations, end quote. Essentially, they are a way of manifesting desire, to be special, to have purpose, that something or someone out there knows and in some way cares about our collective existence. The desire for purpose and self-knowledge is the entry point for a discussion of the alien abduction narrative to be put in conversation with Foucault's technologies of the self. In the technologies of the self, Foucault defines the titular concept in terms of several others, each related to how a subject knows their place in and relationship to the world around them. In truth, technologies of the self are part of a larger paradigm that Foucault creates containing 4 elements: technologies of production, technologies of sign systems, technologies of power, and technologies of the self, which he defines as those which, quote, permit individuals to effect by their own means or with the help of others a certain number of operations on their own bodies and souls, thoughts, conduct, and way of being, so as to transform themselves in order to attain a certain state of happiness, purity, wisdom, perfection, or immortality, end quote. Foucault chooses to further define this concept in the terms of both Greco-Roman philosophy and Christian spirituality, but more generally, for our purposes, technologies of the self can be understood as operating as the axis between to take care of oneself, to know oneself, and to be concerned with oneself. Thinking about alien abduction narratives in terms of Foucault's technologies of the self, there are clear connections. primarily in that the experiencers most often perceive some transformation of self when they are able to narrativize their encounter in order to attain or at least move toward the positive result that Foucault alludes to. To understand and tell their story is to care for themselves, and to know about this formative experience is also, in some ways, to know themselves. But why is this kind of narrativization necessary at all in contemporary American culture? In Alien Chic, Posthumanism, and the Other Within, Neil Badmington seeks to answer that question. Badmington is concerned with the changing perceptions of narratives surrounding alien encounters, both quote-unquote real and fictional. In simplified form, he argues that in the mid-20th century, narratives about alien abduction were set up in, quote, a simple set of binary oppositions. Above all, human versus inhuman, us versus them, and real versus fake, that are as hierarchical as they are absolute. Aliens are not just entirely different from humans, they are at once an enemy to be feared, hated, and destroyed, end quote. While this conception of the relationship between the human and alien persisted for a time, Badmington goes on to argue that we have reached an understanding in American culture that he terms alien love, which, quote, quietly reaffirms a traditional border between them and us, each category defined by its opposite. Crucially, to the shift that he's describing, however, instead of detesting the alien, what is not human, we embrace it in its utility. It helps us know ourselves. Similarly to Badmington, Susan Lepselter discusses the ways that the abduction narrative forms only a part of a larger whole, consisting of, quote, the recursion and resonance between uncanny memories, hauntings, conspiracy theories, captivity narratives, and tales of everyday life. Fantastic stories, like ordinary personal memories, arise amid experiences of class, loss, race, gender, and the body's unmoored location in a world of accelerated technological change, end quote. To Lepselter, abduction narratives are part of a bricolage, both collective and individual, which helps to form the larger narrative and pattern of one's life in search for meaning. To explain this, she puts forward the concept of apophenia, or, quote, the tendency to interpret random patterns as meaningful, end quote. Instead of cultivating randomness, however, Lepselter cites her ethnographic research with abduction experiencers as evidence that these narratives, quote, cultivate apophenia, not as an error, but instead as a way to begin seeing those things that have become invisible. Experiencers pay close attention to parallels and resemblances between stories, and the parallels produce a feeling of, and an aesthetic sense of, resonance, which itself becomes another story, end quote. It is this secondary story that is so important to a discussion of the abduction narrative as a technology of the self. The narrativization in our culture of these experiences helps to give them meaning both at the individual level for an experiencer working through what is, if nothing else, a distressing encounter, and at the collective cultural level, which allows for a larger meaning making. Expanding upon this, D.W. Pasulka discusses how UFO encounters and abductions had been in the past at most fringe, localized beliefs, but they are now, quote-unquote, UFO religions, which are, quote, a widespread worldview that is supercharged by the digital infrastructure that spreads messages and beliefs virally, end quote. Pasulka invokes religion here. She sees belief in the abduction scenario functioning in the lives of many in the same way more mainstream religion does, to help orient one in the world with a concrete set of beliefs, positions, and impulses to follow. As mentioned above, the UFO experiencer narrative is a genre unto itself, but many have been taken up by researchers and collected into volumes of UFO research, part narrative, part theory, part ethnographic research. The following sections will discuss 3 such narratives and how they function as technologies of the self. The first narrative of interest is described by Yvonne Smith in her book Coronado, and was collected by Smith during regression hypnosis sessions with the experiencer. Though regression is somewhat dubious in itself, researchers like Smith believe that even if the events that are recounted are not provably true, it is almost universally the case that the experiencer believes them to be true. Mike Evans, or ME as Smith's notation usually refers to him, is one of the experiencers present during the Coronado group abduction, or CGA, that Smith's book covers in detail. With Smith's help, Mike was able to create a relatively coherent narrative, both of the individual abduction experiences and his overarching lifelong experience with UFOs, which helped to explain various life choices and concerns, and ultimately leading to a kind of resolution. Evans's encounter during the CGA began with what he describes as, quote, a milky white light, end quote, coming through his hotel room windows, followed by shadowy figures moving through the light toward him. His encounter is brief, but culminates in one of the figures inserting a rod or wand into his ear while looming above him. It was this experience which prompted Evans to seek out Smith and regression hypnosis as a solution. Though several of Evans's childhood experiences are recounted in Coronado, one in particular that took place when he was 8 years old is a direct parallel to his experiences during the CGA. This experience, as some of the others that Smith helps to reveal via regression, took place at his grandparents' house and began with another quote-unquote very bright light entering the room where Evans was sleeping. Evans described to Smith how the abduction proceeded, how the alien figure stood in his doorway, bathed in light so bright that Evans was unable to make out anything but the faintest details. Evans then found himself inexplicably transported from his bedroom to a quote-unquote rounded room with no corners, where he was laid upon a table and underwent a sort of medical examination. Given this revelation of a very similar childhood experience, Smith describes Evans' feelings of relief and understanding of his path in life. In a later interview with Smith, Evans describes how the narrative created by his regression session, quote, certainly allowed me to see a side of me that I wasn't aware of. I wouldn't even think that I was as deeply involved in this as I appeared to be. So from that point of view, yeah, I never would have thought that I was going through abductions in my youth, but it's a double-edged sword because knowledge isn't always a pleasant thing. It creates a pattern that I'd be abducted and then I'd get depressed because I wouldn't have any control over my situation. You could see a pattern in that, end quote. Even so, though Evans describes how, after going through several regression sessions and revealing his trajectory, his abduction experiences began to quote-unquote calm down, and that all he wanted was just a quote-unquote peaceful life. In this way, we can see Evans's desire to make the narrative of his experience concise and clean, with a clear beginning and an almost happy end. Given how Evans's life has been organized around his experiences with and belief in the UFO phenomena, we can also see how this construction functions for him as a technology of the self. In creating his own narrative with Smith's help, Evans is clearly performing Foucault's task of transformation of the self, both by his own desire and recollection, and with Smith's aid. In addition, Evans's experience is quite similar to one of Foucault's own examples of technologies of the self, the quote-unquote remembering of the secret self. Quoting Plato, Foucault describes this as when, quote, one must discover the truth that is within one, end quote. In undergoing regression, we see Mike Evans striving for this discovery, seeking what is for him the truth of his experiences. Lepselter's description of Apophenia can also be applied here, inasmuch as the regression allows for Evans to stitch together otherwise disparate aspects of his life, such as his interest and participation in groups such as MUFON, even before any knowledge of his abduction experiences, his explicit encounters, and his overarching feelings about both. In narrativizing his experiences as connected and part of the larger progression of his life, Evans is able to come to terms with them and move toward the happiness and peaceful life that he wishes for. John Mack's book, Abduction, is another ready source of narratives that came to Mike Evans's. Scott and Ed are two of the experiencers named by Mack, who chooses to use pseudonyms for all of his patients, and both share similarities with Mike Evans as their experiences span from childhood through adulthood. However, the men whose narratives are covered in Mack's book have seemingly been touched more deeply by their encounters. According to Mack, Ed is a, quote, technician in his mid-40s at a high-tech firm in Massachusetts, end quote. One day in 1989, Ed suffered what he initially thought was a simple panic attack while out with his wife. Seeking psychological treatment, he encountered John Mack in his role as a practicing psychologist, who eventually helped him recover memories related to quote-unquote frightening childhood experiences, primarily taking place during a trip with a family friend in 1961. In his initial interview, Ed could only recall the shape of his encounter, that upon falling asleep in the cabin where he was spending the night, he suddenly found himself suspended over the precipice of a large cliff face nearby in a quote-unquote pod, accompanied by a female entity, quote, small and slight, with long, straight, thin, silvery blonde hair, end quote. He remembered having, quote-unquote, had intercourse with the being, not uncommon in abduction scenarios, and that she had afterward told him information pertaining to what he perceived as quote-unquote, the laws of the universe. As he struggled to keep all of the information in mind, though, the entity told him that he would, quote, remember when you need to know, end quote. After the above information was revealed in their initial interview, Mack and Ed scheduled a regression hypnosis session where more of the specifics of the encounter were revealed. While the outset of the encounter was much the same and very like abduction narratives of others, Ed was able to recall additional narrative details which are crucial to his later self-making and include being including being told the following by the entity he encountered. Quote, "Listen to the earth, Ed. You can hear the earth. You can hear the anguish of the spirits. You can hear the wailing cries of the imbalances. It will save you. Things are going to happen. The earth itself is enraged at humanity's stupidity. The earth's skin is going to swat some bugs off that do not know how to work in symbiotic harmony." End quote. Both Ed himself and Mac attach great significance to this warning. Mac finds it to be working within an established framework of UFO experiences, that of prophetic, quote-unquote, apocalyptic visions. Ed, on the other hand, has organized his life and self around them, his quote-unquote whole self being shaped by the encounter. Mac explains that regardless of the verifiability of the information, Ed has, quote, taken the information seriously enough to change his life and commit himself to communicating what he has learned to others who will listen, end quote. Similarly to Ed's experiences, Mac has also collected a narrative from another man, Scott. Mac describes Scott as a, quote, tall, husky, forthright young man whose slightly breezy manner belies his underlying thoughtfulness and sensitivity, end quote. Scott's abduction experiences, like Mike's and Ed's, have occurred throughout his life, or, at the very least, have affected the whole of it. He comes from a family of abductees. His mother Emily and sister Lee have also been abducted. However, the most salient UFO experience that Scott describes occurs in April 1990, where he underwent an out-of-body experience where he floated above his own body, seeing it hooked up to many quote-unquote electrodes and machines. It isn't this experience itself, though, that is so interesting about Scott's case. Rather, it is his own understanding of its meaning with respect to his lifelong abduction experiences. During another of his abduction experiences, Scott was shown, quote, a non-human female figure carrying a tray with several cylinders, each containing a little baby, end quote. Scott understood these to be his own hybrid children, created from samples taken from him during his earlier abduction experiences. Furthermore, in the same regression session with Mac, Scott recalled being told by the entities that he was, quote unquote, part of their family. This is the crux of the rest of Scott's experiences. Scott gained a tremendous amount of clarity from this revelation as he says, quote, I've always known that I was different, that I wasn't from around here, end quote. In short, it is Scott's belief that he himself has a quote-unquote dual nature, a human side and an alien one, ostensibly that he himself is the product of a hybrid program. It is important here to note once again that regardless of the veracity of Scott's claims, his life has been organized around a belief in them. As Max says, this revelation has allowed Scott to achieve, quote, considerable peace of mind and a deeper sense of understanding of the abduction process. By overcoming his denial and accepting the instinctual, natural basis of his bodily terror and resentment, Scott has been able to open his psyche to important information concerning a widening sense of his own identity, end quote. While Mac acknowledges that it is hard to, quote-unquote, know what to make of Scott's perspective here, there are obvious implications with respect to how this can be read as a technology of the self, especially concerning Scott's identity and purpose. Taking Ed and Scott's experiences together, both exemplify the ways in which abduction narratives can function as technologies of the self, and how they relate to Badminton's concept of alien love, where humanness is defined in opposition to what is perceived to be alien or other. To refer back to Foucault's initial definition, both men have undergone a transformation in their sense of self, and they've been able to move past what was otherwise a troubling series of experiences to formulate a new identity with the help of the narratives they've been able to create and organize. Their lives are bound up in the UFO phenomena, both by choice and via what they experienced during their abductions. But they each have been able to construct a coherent narrative for a life's worth of experiences that can help them achieve Foucault's quote-unquote happiness, purity, and wisdom. Ed was told by the female entity in his teenage experience that he had a quote-unquote greater agenda, which he was able to articulate with Mac's help, while Scott was able to overcome an intense period of, quote, vigilant, animalistic, and fear-laden defensiveness with intense feelings of vulnerability, helplessness, and separateness, end quote, and reconcile it with the quote-unquote love and connection that coincides with his dual identity. As for alien love, we see this in both sets of experiences as well. In Ed's, the human, destructive, unclean, the quote-unquote bugs to be swatted off, is put in contrast with nature, the implied alien, the spirit. In Scott's experience, this contrast is even more explicit in his dual identity, as, quote, the alien perspective, which apparently has always been embedded in Scott's consciousness, was not available to him until he surrendered the illusion of control. In his alien identity, he comprehends how fear and anger, which are not part of the alien experience, constrict our capacity for love and connection, end quote. All of this comes together to allow Scott and Ed, and Mike as well, to refer back to our previous case, to position themselves effectively in the world and to understand and make sense of what otherwise are disparate, often frightening experience they've had at different moments in their lives. Mike, Scott, and Ed aren't the only ones, though, who are concerned with the UFO phenomena. In June 2021, after years of pressure from various sources, the Department of Defense was forced to put out a report to Congress on unidentified aerial phenomena of information collected between 2004 and 2021, and though the report doesn't add much information to the wider discourse on UFOs, it does show that the American people, and even those in high places, are still fascinated with the phenomena as a whole. Joel Achenbach, in his piece for the Washington Post magazine on the subject, compares the UAP disclosure to more conspiracy-minded reactions to the COVID-19 pandemic. As a society, we have a very difficult time accepting situations where, quote, we do not know, is the best answer that we can find, end quote. Thus, we are naturally inclined to seek out meaning elsewhere. Achenbach, a skeptic, muses that in his own experience, people who believe in UAP or UFO phenomena, quote, were not crazy or uneducated, nor uninformed. They use different factors and probability estimates in their mental equations as they search for answers, so their answers were different from mine. They could be right, I could be wrong, end quote. So what does it all mean? Here we can return to Susan Lepselter as she tries to connect these pieces of the abduction phenomena that are, quote, never a one-to-one kind of symbol. The accumulated stories that point to a forgotten something do suggest that something might be. These are stories of class and its invisible, unmakeable limitations, and stories of race and gender and the small, multiple ways that a life is disappointed by master narratives of progress and success, end quote. For Lepselter, these experiences, Mike's, Ed's, Scott's, and others, are tools, Foucault's technologies, that allow those who find themselves outside these quote-unquote master narratives of the American consciousness, one which the recent government disclosure shows us is alive and well today. Instead of despair, Mike, Ed, and Scott, and many others who believe to have had similar experiences, have been able to find peace and happiness through the narrativization of their own experience and the meaning-making that they've been able to achieve. Thank you for watching.